for Faith and Flourishing, and I like to say that we nourish to flourish. We nourish you students. Tonight we are nourishing you in two ways, body and in mind. There is one box of Chick-fil-A left, and I was going to say that it's a free, the calf scramble for the last box. I was going to say that it's free Chick-fil-A, but of course it's not free. It's free to you, but it's not free to me. So you can be grateful for our very generous donors. And if you're not a donor, go to faithandflourishing.org and click the donate button. But we all to exercise the intellectual virtues that you learn about in your Gateway programming. And so tonight we're going to ask you to exhibit intellectual carefulness as you pay attention to what our speaker has to say, intellectual fair-mindedness as you consider an idea that may not be your own, either from the speaker or in the Q&A afterwards. And also, perhaps some of you will exhibit and try out intellectual courage, as after the lecture, I will wander around with a microphone to those that raise their hand, and you may hear yourself ask a question before your professors and your peers that makes you uncomfortable or other people uncomfortable. But that's what the university is about. If you can't speak your mind and learn the truth at John Brown University as an undergraduate, where will you do it? Well, I hear you're munching, and if you had Dr. Vila for OT survey, you may not know that praying is talking to God, but I'm going to go ahead and hopefully Dr. Vila is here, but I'm going to go ahead and pray for us before we begin. Heavenly Father, thank you for the great privilege that we have of exercising our minds. Thank you for this food to nourish our bodies. We pray that you'd bless this food to nourish our bodies. We pray that you would give us the opportunity to learn, to discuss, to reflect, and to discover the truth. Thank you that you are good and you are good to us. And it's in your strong and powerful name we pray. Amen. Amen. Well, it's my privilege to introduce Dr. J.W. Richards, who's the director of the Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Life, Religion, and Family, and the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow in Religious Liberty and Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation. Jay is the author or editor of more than a dozen books, including several New York Times bestsellers. He's also the creator and executive producer of several documentaries, and his articles and essays have been widely published. Jay's work has also been widely covered in the pages of the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, as well as Nature, Science, and Physics Today, and many other publications. Jay has been on hundreds of radio and television programs from CNN and MSNBC to PBS and Fox News. Tomorrow, Jay was telling me that he'll fly to New York to lecture tomorrow night at Columbia University, and later in the week, he will speak at the United Nations at the request of the government of Guatemala. Put another way, it's just downhill from here. But more importantly to me, Jay is a kind, gracious, and caring person. These are contentious topics, but he takes them on because he really and truly cares about people. So having said that, John Brown University, let's show Dr. Jay Richards how we greet our guests. Thank you.
Well, it's so great to be with you. Professor Bruce and I have known each other for years. We see each other at least once or twice a year. But it's my first time to John Brown. And actually, I have had two staffers. So another thing I sort of did on the side, I was a co-founder of a Christian website called The stream.org. And I have had two John Brown graduates at different times, including one that's there right now. I'm not going to mention her name because I don't want to embarrass her, but she's a recent grad and terrific. So good to be with you tonight. And so I am going to talk about three topics that themselves deserve their own talks. So I'm going to treat all three of them somewhat superficially, obviously, because I want essentially give you a picture of what I think is going on that's broader than these three topics. And so here's the hypothesis I'm working on. Let's assume that the truth about the human person is something like what is described in Genesis 1, that human beings are creatures, the human beings are the crowning achievement of the creation, but not its only purpose. That human beings are tended to be stewards or vice regents of that part of the created order over which God has placed them. That we are created, for whatever this means, in the image of that creator. That we are created male and female, so that somehow we're both individually image bearers of God, but that also somehow we only ultimately fulfill what it means to be made in the image of God, at least as a human race, in this complementary relationship of male and female. And finally, that human beings are fully physical and fully spiritual beings, made from the dust of the earth, in which has been breathed the breath of God. So that's, I didn't count those, but that's like 6 or 7 or 8 truth claims. And we'll say, let's say the truth about man, that is the truth about humanity. And so if that's true, then that is true about every human person and every human being. And so in a sense, insofar as people know about themselves and have access to themselves, they have an awareness, they have some form of knowledge of the truth of these things without special revelation, simply by virtue of being the type of being that I've just described. And so then what happens if you have a view of reality that denies one or more of those claims? What do? What happens intellectually? What form of intellectual virtues and vices do you exercise? So do you see this sort of dilemma? Assume that these things are true about the human person, and then also take what's obvious, which is that lots of people about whom, according to the hypothesis, these things are true, deny these things. What happens? Well, what happens, and this is the main argument, all right, about which I'm going to say I'm going to give you 3 examples of this. So we'll call it metaphysical schizophrenia, all right? So that let's say you okay, you deny the fact that human beings are made in the image of God and are spiritual beings, right? So you reduce the human person to their animal nature or to our material nature. But at the same time, you are yourself a spiritual being. You have a capacity for freedom and the ability to transcend the physical properties and the chemical properties of your body. You will be both denying this and participating in the very thing that you're denying at one and the same time. So you end up with a weird kind of schizophrenia in which you bounce back and forth between 2 different truths. So one day you're a hardcore materialist, and then the other day, you're a kind of Gnostic that denies the importance of the body. And you can manage to do both of these things unreflectively without even realizing it. Because this is what I think actually tends to happen, is what we imagine in a kind of certain level of, say, Christian worldview analysis. We'll say, well, okay, you go off to state university and you learn materialism, and then you are going to apply the materialist worldview sort of consistently and constantly, because we're all just little logic machines. You're going to deductively work out what it means to be a materialist. That's not actually right. It's that kind of first step in when you first start thinking about this. But what actually happens is that you might develop a worldview, or that, by which I mean just a kind of view of reality that's out of keeping with reality itself, but you're going to constantly be engaged in and dealing with the reality itself. So you might deny that, say, there are universal moral truths, but then you get really angry and get morally indignant at people that disagree with you about moral claims, right? It's not that you say there are no moral claims. You think, no, that person that, I don't know, voted for Trump is evil, right? So you both deny that there are moral truths and you get morally indignant. You see the idea? All right. And so this, I think, is actually, it's a more helpful and way of interpreting what actually happens in our culture when the culture becomes fragmented and you get fundamentally incompatible ways of viewing reality. And there's a kind of an implicit argument here too. It's that you want to get anthropology right if you want to get other things right. If you want to get economics right, if you want to get politics right, if you want to get family life right, you need to understand the truth about the human person and then think carefully about what the implications of that truth are. There's also a kind of an implicit way of doing apologetics here. Because if it's true that certain distorted ideas end up developing these metaphysical schizophrenias, Christians who have the story right can diagnose and explain certain things that people already know to be true at some level and explain it better than their own account, right? It's not a deductive proof of the reliability of Scripture, the truth of the Apostles' Creed. It's not that simple, but there's an explanatory power to the Christian story, a Christian way of describing things that's really powerful. So what I want to do is just give you 3 examples of powerful ideas, all of which exhibit this kind of metaphysical schizophrenia. So the first one is called deep ecology, or you might call radical environmentalism. So I'm not talking about the general idea of environmental stewardship or creation care or anything like that. I'm talking about a very particular kind of intellectual strand of the larger environmental movement that has in some ways become a kind of more dominant theme much more recently, and that's deep ecology. So deep ecology was developed by a Norwegian philosopher named Arne Næss in 1973. And here's his basic idea. This is the kind of brief single picture summary of Næss's idea, is that his argument was that the environmental crisis was the result of the kind of Judeo-Christian understanding of the human person or the human being as the kind of highest being, that in the sense we're sort of the top of the pyramid of organisms, the most important one, the most developed, the most evolved, if you're thinking that way. And he said, that's the problem. That's why we have an ecological crisis. And his argument was that we have to transform our understanding and our relationship with nature and start thinking about the natural world as if everything has an intrinsic value apart from humans. Okay, now I want you to listen carefully here, because notice his argument is that the prior way of viewing things, this Christian way, claimed that things don't have an intrinsic value apart from humans. Now, has anybody learned that in their Bible class? Probably not, right? But that's what he claims in deep ecology. And he said, so the only way to solve this is to realize that there is no difference between the self and the other. So there's no difference between you and, I don't know, the nematode out there in the mud, or, you know, a cow across town or something like that. Now, what do you think happens if you actually sort of apply this consistently? Right, so it'd be one thing if we were saying, well, the only thing that matters is human beings, and nothing else has value, or it only has value insofar as it serves human beings, right? That's sort of one thing. But what happens if we actually tried to consistently apply the idea that there is no difference between the human being and any other organism? Well, it doesn't take a lot to realize that, okay, well, humans then, that means, don't have any more value than a plant, for instance, right? Or a non-human animal. And so there ends up being a deeply, deeply misanthropic or anti-human thread to this. And you see this also, anyone that takes an environmental ethics course will almost certainly have heard of this famous article that's very similar to what Næss said. This was actually written in 1967, so a few years before Næss actually developed deep ecology. It was written in, this is Science magazine, so very prominent American scientific magazine. And it's called The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis. And the essential argument was that the biblical description of human beings was the cause of the ecological crisis in the early 1970s. And this is a direct quote from this article. He says, by destroying pagan animism, so by replacing the pagan idea that everything is sort of spiritual, that there's spirits and beings in everything in nature, as opposed to the kind of biblical idea, which is that there's a natural world that God has created, but everything isn't a little divine being. So by destroying pagan animism, Christianity made it possible to exploit nature, White said. He warned, we shall continue to have a worsening ecological crisis until we reject the Christian axiom that nature has no reason for existence save to serve man. Did you hear that? What did he say a Christian axiom was? That nature has no purpose other than to serve man. Now, can anyone tell me what Bible verse says that? Nowhere, right? It doesn't say this. In fact, it's a very kind of bizarre thing. This is a self-assigned a kind of biblical illiteracy all the way back in the 60s. Like, he didn't have Google, but could you at least like check the Bible and cite a verse, right? This has never been a Christian idea at any time in Christian history. That could be a distortion of it. But you read Genesis 1, right? Even if you just read the first chapter of the Bible, God spends 6 days creating other things before he creates humans. Now, if you read it carefully, you'll notice that on day 6, God creates the land animals, remember, and you would expect, okay, now he's done if he's going to follow the normal pattern of the previous days. But then he has this encore where he stops and he speaks to himself in the plural, right? He says, let us make man in our image after our likeness, male and female, he created them. You know the text. And then he creates them, and then he speaks to them and he commands and blesses them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Now, he doesn't say destroy, right? Have dominion, and he says, have dominion over the birds of the air and the fish of the sea and every living thing. And dominion, of course, here is clearly referring to kind of a derivative dominion of the benevolent king of the universe who's created us, right? So there is nothing in this text, and we could go through the Psalms, we could go through the book of Job, in which God rebukes Job. Where were you when I created Leviathan and Behemoth? Behold, Orion, right? In other words, I got a bunch of stuff going you don't know anything about. You're important too, but that's not the only thing happening. That's just a really easily derived kind of summary of what Scripture actually says about the human person. So notice even the ability to kind of describe it and summarize it accurately becomes difficult. So that two very smart guys, Lynn White and Arne Ness, couldn't even manage to summarize what the actual biblical claim was. So what I'm arguing here is that they're already missing it. So they already think that if there is a claim that humans have intrinsic value, or that they could be the crowning achievement and the steward of creation, or that they could be made in the image of God, that's somehow equivalent to saying nothing else has value, right? And so there's already this kind of fracturing of the kind of complex truth of the whole, right? And so guess what happens, though, that when you do this, you end up debasing your understanding of human beings. And so you'll find this, and this is easy as pie. There was a stage in my career in which I used to actually debate these issues. And you can give just some incredible kind of terrifying quotes from people who claim to be concerned about the environment, in which they describe humans as locusts, essentially. And so they only see human beings as sort of consumers and spoilers and destroyers, as if we're not also creators and cultivators and farmers and things like that. Because this is what happens, right? If you sort of don't have a kind of appropriate understanding of what the human person is in relation to the rest of creation, you're very likely to debase the human person, and hence to be anti-human, despite your best intentions. By anti-human, I don't mean that you say or consciously say, I hate humans. To be anti-human in this case is simply to view humans in a way that's contrary to the truth about the human person. Insofar as it's contrary, even if it looks like you're elevating human beings, you're actually debasing them, right? I'll give you another example of how this happens, right? It's related to something I'm going to say in a minute. You might have thought in 1965 that the sexual revolution was about elevating sex, and just sort of sex is about everything and we're going to degrade everything else. In 2023, we're actually sterilizing kids. We're doing that, right? And so if you thought the sexual revolution was about elevating sex, why are we sterilizing kids? It's because it wasn't about that. It's actually by distorting the reality and the truth about what sex is and its value, we end up debasing it, even if it looks like we're elevating it, all right? So I'm repeating this over and over because I'm wanting to kind of suggest to you sort of dialectical way of interpreting what actually ends up happening when people fail to capture or to grasp the rich whole of what it means to be human. Second example is transhumanism. I was actually just about less than 2 weeks ago with Ray Kurzweil, who's a kind of grandfather of transhumanism. This this topic has for 20 years, I sometimes talk about it and write about it, and then I'll leave it for a while. And because it's basically AI goes through these different phases. And so there's a time where somebody says, oh, we're going to have those self-driving cars in 6 weeks. Oh, it's not going to happen. And so there's a hype, and then it doesn't happen. And so then it kind of drifts, right? And then there's a time, and now we've got generative AI and we've got chat GPT. So we're on the upswing again. So everybody's talking about it. So we're in a hype cycle again. So this sort of returns. What is transhumanism? Okay, so transhumanism is related to some things that y'all heard about. It's related to artificial intelligence. It's related to something called posthumanism. But the simplest way to understand transhumanism is the view that the human being is a transition in cosmic evolution. All right, and so there's this kind of process in which, and remember, nothing in this process is purposeful or designed or created, right? So you got to understand that's part of the story, right? And so you get the sort of long period of time in which somehow laws create everything from nothing. Don't ask too many questions, and then you get sort of atoms, and they sort of come together, and you get life, and then you eventually get human beings that are these complex zones that become self-aware in some ways. But we're very imperfect. We don't live very long. We get diseased. We're not really very smart. And so what we are is, if you take the kind of long view of cosmic evolution, you see that the human stage, in which our hardware is this soft, highly fallible stuff, is a very temporary stage that is going to be followed by the technological stage. And in that stage, what we will do effectively is that we will upload ourselves to more durable hardware, and we will leave this mortal coil behind, and ideally we will live forever. All right. So when it's described that way, it sounds kind of dumb, right? Who's going to believe that? Trust me, the smartest, richest people in the country generally believe this. They're clustered in California for various reasons, but this is not nearly the fringe idea that it might sound in my kind of brief summary. So Ray Kurzweil, for instance, whom I know, in fact, I did a book with him now, I guess, almost 20 years ago, is a leading advocate of this. He is the director of engineering at the Google Corporation, which you might have heard of. So this is not a fringe idea, all right? And he has an amazing kind of argument here. He says if you sort of analyze the development of different things over time, what you will discover is this pattern of either quadratic or exponential growth, so that certain kinds of things that look like they start out slow actually really start speeding up. And so just a kind of famous example would be Moore's Law. Moore's Law is this, to simplify, it's this idea that every 18 to 24 months, the processing speed, or the number of transistors that you could put on a microprocessor, roughly doubles. Right, so it doesn't go up 10 or 15%, it doubles, so that you get this doubling effect. And so what that means is that at some point you're going to get, if you're sort of tracking the number of transistors, or let's just say computing power you could get for $1,000, you'll see that the growth looks like this, but then all of a sudden there'll be this kind of bend, this hockey stick bend in the curve, in which it goes almost vertical, and things start really speeding up. And so Kurzweil, he's got this big thick book called The Singularity is Near, where he gives literally scores of examples of this in cosmology and physics and biology, and especially in technology. And so that undergirds his argument that we're at this moment in technological evolution in which the curve is going almost vertical, so that things are changing so very quickly that there's going to be a time in your lifetimes, and if you're young, you're actually lucky, I've got good news for you, in which technology is going to surpass in every way everything that we can do, which kind of can sound depressing if you watch Terminator. But Kurzweil has good news for you. We will not just let them do that. We will slowly offload ourselves and merge with this technology in a transhuman future. Now, if you read this just in a slightly Freudian way, it starts to look weird, kind of technological version of Christian eschatology, which isn't necessarily a coincidence. But notice what's happening here, right? So if you don't get the humans are fully material, we're bodies, we have bodies that are not incidental to us, they're not meat suits that we just kind of wear around, but we're also fully spiritual. If you don't get that, then what are you going to do? Well, you're either going to treat us like a meat suit, right, that can be cast away, but at the same time, we're these disembodied entities that can be uploaded to new hardware. What's that? Well, that kind of makes sense. I don't know if you could have a soul or something that you could sort of upload to technology, but trust me, Ray Kurzweil and the guys that advocate this are all materialists, metaphysical schizophrenia, because they know at one and the same time, they believe philosophically that matter is all there is, but at the same time, they also know that they are selves, that they are persons not reducible to their bodies, and so they at the same time imagine that these selves can ultimately be uploaded. But again, what you end up finding is a kind of depressing anti-human element. And so if you read Kurzweil's arguments, because his argument will be essentially that our machines will eventually become like we are. So our computers will get fast and sophisticated enough, they'll wake up and be conscious agents just like we are. And if you're kind of a philosopher and you say, well, now how is that exactly supposed to work? There's nothing happening in a computer that would lead you to think it's going to become conscious at some point. You'll say, well, yeah, that's true, but it happened in our case, right? We're just the result of these kind of blind processes of cosmic evolution that eventually became conscious, so it must be possible. And then if you press them, they'll say, well, who's to say we're conscious? Maybe it's an illusion. I'm not making this up. They will argue that you are an illusion. So what's happening? Either they elevate computers to the level of humans, or they reduce humans to the level of computers, right? And so this is what you get. Man is either merely a machine or is some kind of weird disembodied uploadable self. All right, so that's anti-human example number 2 with the weird metaphysical schizophrenia. Number 3, gender ideology. All right, so I'm going to spend a little more time on this because this happens to be the thing that I work on now full time. So what the heck is gender ideology? And so when I first started working on this, what I noticed is that everybody kind of knows what it is, right? In the wrong body. It is the thing that causes children to, and physicians and pediatricians to tell girls, for instance, who feel gender distress or distress at their sex bodies, that can be fixed by taking cross-sex hormones and maybe undergoing surgery. It's the thing that leads to lots of things that you see on TikTok, except I know none of you are on TikTok, but you would see if you were on TikTok, right? We all know it by its effects, but if you ask someone, what exactly is the claim of gender ideology? It's really hard. Like a lot of people say, well, it's the claim that you can change genders or change sex. But if you look at sort of people that defend this ideology, they will never say that. They will never say that you're changing your gender. That's never what they'll say. They'll say something different. So let me kind of boil this down best I can, all right, into what's essentially happened. And you could sort of think of gender ideology as the tale of 2 words that we have in English. So we happen to have 2 words we've inherited from different threads of modern English language, sex, gender. If you trace this, what you'll find is that these words were being used roughly synonymously for centuries. I mean, you can find the word gender being used in this way in the middle of the 1400s, roughly as the same thing, to refer to the difference that we all observe between men and women, between male and female, right? So these persisted as synonyms for a very long time. Sex then, sometime in the 19th century, when we started getting this idea about what biology is like, sex came to be the preferred term to refer to this difference in a biological sense. And gender kind of dropped out and didn't tend to be used for that. But then in the 1960s, certain theorists said, okay, well, we can actually, let's distinguish between sex and gender. And these will refer to 2 different things. That was an initial kind of transition. So sex ends up being something like a biological difference, and gender is the kind of social difference between male and female. So that's an initial introduction of saying, okay, these words, let's have them refer to 2 different things, right? But then something else happened. We quit using the word sex altogether. So if you go to the doctor now, I'm quite certain, even in Arkansas, and you have to fill out a form, it will ask you for your gender and not for your sex. When I was a kid, that didn't happen. It said sex. So there were kind of several things happening, right? 2 words that started as synonyms, then got distinguished, Then the word sex dropped out and got used entirely. We used just the word gender. That's part of what was happening. Something else was happening sort of under the ground, like the tectonic plates moving under the continents, in which what sex or the word gender refers to starts shifting for ideological reasons, according to this thing that I'm calling gender ideology. So that gender at one and the same time, one person could be using the word and think they're talking about, well, the difference between boys and girls, and someone else is using the word to refer to something else, right? And this is the phase change now, okay? So watch what happened. This is gender ideology. It is the replacement or the subordination or the dissolution of sex as a biological reality. And its replacement with two other concepts that are not synonyms of that. What are those? Gender identity and sex assigned at birth. All right? Now, once you see this, you can't unsee it. And so if you see, for instance, a famous hearing of a recent Supreme Court justice when she was not a Supreme Court justice, and I'm sure all of you remember this, but a member of a member of the committee asked her what a woman was. And what did she say? Does anybody remember? I'm not a biologist. She said, she was a kind of a giveaway. She said, I'm not a biologist. So she actually implied that a biologist would know the answer, right? So that was a giveaway. But what she knew is that she couldn't answer the question, was not allowed to answer the question. Of course, she knows what a woman is, right? She was in other contexts, saying she was the first African-American woman on the Supreme Court. So she must have known what it was. So why wouldn't she answer? It's because she was aware of the kind of shifting definition. And if she said, well, a woman is an adult human female, she'd be committing to this old way of understanding these things. And so anger some other people. But if she said, well, a woman is anyone who identifies as a woman, well, that sounds crazy to most everybody else, right? And so she just couldn't answer. So that's a sign something weird has happened. What happened is that sex is a biological reality, at least for sort of public, official, respectable conversation, has now dropped out. And you have something called gender identity and sex assigned at birth. What is gender identity? Does anybody know? If you Googled this right now, what would it tell you gender identity is? That's it, right? That's it. You're thinking, oh, this can't be right. That's it. How someone identifies. So it's your internal sense of gender. So your subjective or internal sense of gender. Okay, but it's called gender identity. So you still want to know, but what's gender? No, don't ask that. Yeah. But what you're never going to get is always from sex. Always. And anyone that's properly sort of schooled in how to think in this way. I'm pausing and spending a lot of time on this because this is by far the weirdest thing that's ever happened in human history intellectually. And I want you to just kind of stare at the beast with me for a moment so you understand what's happening. All right. So there was a thing called a sex that referred to this biological difference between males and females. We all know what it is. Every culture has recognized it at every time and place. We have a hard time kind of explaining it, as we'll see in a minute. We've all known what it was. That's now gone. That's passé. It's replaced by an internal sense of gender, the subjective sense of yourself. And then if you say, okay, but wait, I've got female on my birth certificate. What's that? Isn't that my sex? I said, well, no. What this is that doctors and people conventionally started associating certain kind of body types with things called sex. And so they attached these labels to us. But they're not true about the things themselves. They're assigned. They're attached to you. All right? So it's not a real thing. Insofar as there's a real thing, it's your gender identity. That's the real, true, given truth about you. Your sex is a social construct. Right? It's imposed a convention. So you see what's happened? Rather than there being this biological universal reality that we have access to and understand, there is an internal, purely subjective thing that, by the way, is independent of your body. It has to be. And a social convention called sex assigned at birth. All right. And so once you get that, you'll realize, okay, why people are saying things the way they are. Now, you might think that's just too crazy. That can't quite be what you're saying, Jay. That can't be it. So I'm going to prove it to you with what you will now find if you Google say biological sex and go to images, this is what you're going to get. So this is the genderbred person 3.3. How many of you saw this in school or are willing to admit that? I know some of you have at least seen this. It's a very popular image, went through different stages. The purpose of this is it's a catechetical aid for young children who might otherwise find gender ideology kind of obscure or hard to understand. Right. And so basically it says, rather than thinking about your peers and you and your friends as boys and girls, think about them as having these different aspects. All right. And so there are these aspects and they exist along a continuum. Right. And so there's your identity, which is how you identify. Right. And that's called your gender identity along a spectrum of womanness or male or manness. All right. And then you have your gender expression, which is how you just express yourself, what kind of clothing you wear. Do you do kind of an up lilt in your voice, or something like that? You say like a lot, you wear makeup, right? This is sort of gender expression. It can be feminine or masculine, but again, these are sliding scales. Then there's biological sex. Okay, now I'm going to flag that for you, okay, and we'll come back to it. And then there is your attraction, or you could think of as your orientation, who you're romantically and sexually attracted to. And these are these different aspects of yourself. Now, and this poor guy's named Sam Killerman, he's a Gen Xer like me. So he wasn't taught gender ideology as a first language. He had to learn it later. So he had a hard time understanding it. That's why this is version 3.3. He kept saying, oh, well, here, let me help you. I'll teach this. And then the really committed Orthodox gender ideologues would say, you don't get it at all. And so he would come up with a new version. And so this was a problematic version 3.3 where he hadn't quite fully gotten it. Right. So what was problematic from the perspective of Orthodox gender ideology about genderbred person 3.3? All right. So actually a few things. First one is that the identity is connected to a brain. All right. So a brain, there was this idea that maybe what gender dysphoria is, this distress that some people have about their sex body, that maybe it's the result of you're a male, but you have a female brain or vice versa. And that was an idea for a while. We now know it's actually not true. So that was sort of problematic because it also noticed it attaches to a physical body. But this was the big problem, biological sex. He was still holding on to this idea that, yeah, there could be gender identity expression, but of course, there's still biological sex. I learned that in high school biology. Nobody's surely not denying that. That would be crazy. No, sorry, Sam Killerman, you've gotten it wrong. And then, of course, the obvious problem is that the genderbred person looks like a man. You can call him like a person, but it looks obviously like a genderbred man. And so he's since updated it, but in the meantime, someone else displaced him, the gender unicorn. That managed to get the kind of essence, of the true gospel here. And so notice what's happened. Now, every bit of this, I'd nuke an hour talking about this diagram if I could, but I just want you to notice it's kind of the same, right? You've got gender identity, you've got gender expression, various things, but notice what's changed. Okay, so now we have an androgynous unicorn, right? It's purple. It's a fantasy object. There's no brain, right? It's just a thought bubble of a rainbow, but it's a thought bubble, right? So it's purely ethereal. But here's really the key thing right here. Sex assigned at birth. All right. So that is the kind of congealed, hardened, received Orthodox understanding of gender ideology. Do you understand it now? Do you see what's happening? And so no gender ideologue is going to say you would change genders. What they would say is that, well, you might be male as your sex assigned at birth, but your identity, your gender identity is female or non-binary. So in other words, what you really are is your identity is going to be that internal sense of yourself, and your body, it can be a mistake. So that you were born in the wrong body. The you, which is the gender identity, was born in the wrong body because there's this discordance. So now you can see how it's possible to use a term like gender affirming care. So gender affirming care first is a medical protocol that starts with social transition, in which you say a boy says, okay, I identify as a girl, and so you change his name, you use female pronouns, you have him, use the girl's bathroom. So it's kind of a social intervention, followed, if he's young enough, by puberty blockers to prevent him from going through male puberty, followed by cross-sex hormones, which in this case would be estradiol or estrogen, followed then ultimately by surgery to modify certain external, and internal sex traits so that they conform more closely to your gender identity. So that is called gender affirming care in the sense that think of it as gender identity affirming care. So the way to treat a child who feels a discord between his or her internal sense and his or her body is not by helping him or her adjust to his or her bodily reality, which you might think that would be the way to treat this. No, what you do is you change the body with drugs and surgery to conform to the internal sense of gender. So see, that internal sense of gender is fundamental, and bodily sex is either irrelevant or it's subordinated or it's just a social construct. Does that make sense? That's what's happening. All right. Now, you will never get like that really clear description, unfortunately, precisely because if people are told this directly and realize, I'm pretty sure like about 95% of the population is like, nope, time to homeschool. I mean, this is a kind of the natural reaction. And I'm telling you that this is the reflex. And we've got data on this, by the way. It's a bipartisan response. Like, what? And so you're never going to get it kind of clearly described this way. But once it's described this way, you'll see that it's actually happening. All right. So again, what's happening? So notice the metaphysical schizophrenia, right? The truth is that humans are fully material and fully spiritual. What's happened here is a fragmenting of that in which the body is actually so insignificant that you can just totally sort of change it and make it, try to make it the opposite of what it looks like it is. And this gender identity, this subjective sense of self is fundamental. It's a form of Gnosticism. And yet, so this is, you wouldn't expect this because for a generation we've been, if anything, the public philosophy has been materialism. So the last thing you'd think would get popular is this idea that we're these disembodied selves that can kind of change around our bodies. But that's what happens, because the reality is that even if you're being taught materialism, you still know yourself at one and the same time. And so you end up with these very strange metaphysical schizophrenias. All right? Okay, so how do we respond to this? And I'm just kind of briefly outline how we respond to this. And it is a combination of faith and reason. This is something for all, especially for Christians, to remember, is that the world that God has created is God's world. It has its own rules and its own principles that are embedded in it. So God, the sort of traditional way of describing this is that God has two books of revelation. He has the book of Scripture, in which he reveals himself specially in history to Moses on Mount Sinai, and preeminently in the person of Jesus Christ, and is preserved historically. So that God reveals himself. He can reveal his personal name, does that specially, but he's not dropping into an alien world. He's dropping into a world that he's created that has its own structures in it. So that's why Paul in Romans 1 can say that, the Gentile, even though he had not the law, has the law written on his heart. In other words, atheists have moral knowledge, even if they've never heard Scripture or know the Ten Commandments. In the same way that people have self-knowledge. They know their persons. They experience their capacity for freedom, even if their metaphysic denies that that's possible. And so I think the right response to these things is both to sort of illuminate what people actually already know, but then also show how special revelation illuminates it in a way that their fractured kind of picture of it simply does not, and holds the thing together much better. And I'm thinking of this, there's a great document, and you don't have to be Catholic to appreciate this. It's a document by Pope John Paul II called Faith and Reason about this dynamic. And he says that faith and reason are like the two wings which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. The Pope after him, Pope Benedict XVI, actually gave a controversial lecture in which he said the time is coming, because of the denial of reason in Western culture, in which it will fall to the church to be the remaining defender of reason, right? Not just of faith, not just of revelation, but of reason itself. And so that's what I think our duty is. So the first is just this response to deep ecology, right, which I already actually gave it. The Christian claim, the biblical claim, is not that the only purpose of creation is human beings. It's a much richer and more complex and textured image of that from the beginning to the end. This is not something that was like a sidelight. You can read Christian theology from the beginning of the church to the present, and there was an understanding of this. Remember, Adam names the animals. God spends a bunch of time creating stuff before he ever creates humans. So humans are the crowning achievement. Humans are made in the image of God to be stewards of creation. We're not its only purpose. And we can say all those things at the same time. We also say that the creation is good in the sense that God created it good, but it's also fallen and fractured. We can say both of those things. And that double truth accounts for things much better than sort of partial side explanations. There's also really good kind of philosophical critiques of the transhumanist argument. So part of what animates transhumanism is something called a strong artificial intelligence. It's this conviction that the artificial intelligence we actually experience, and so you experience it every time you do a Google search, or now ChatGPT, which is great, or the Bing AI chatbot. By the way, professors, your students that know how to use this, you're going to need to move to oral exams if you want to work around that, FYI, because they're really, really good. But strong AI assumes that at some point these systems become sentient. All right. But there has been a really good knockdown, drag out philosophical argument developed by John Searle against this for decades called the Chinese room argument. I won't go into it in detail because it's a little complicated to do it justice. This is a cartoon, looks kind of like Searle here. Said, but no, what computers do is they work at the level of syntax or symbols. They don't work at the level of meaning. And so you can imagine a scenario, let's say, and you don't know Chinese, but you have a rule ledger, and the rule ledger, you're going to get an input from one side of the room that's going to be a symbol. Turns out it's a Chinese symbol. You don't even know that. And your rule, you get an input from one side of the room that's going to be a symbol. Turns out it's a Chinese symbol. You don't even know that. And your rule ledger says, okay, if you get this symbol, find the card corresponding to this other symbol and then slip it into the output. All right. And you just do that and you just follow the rule ledger. And so you could do this, right? And so the guy that's trapped in the Chinese room, he would be doing this. Now, it turns out this is what's happening. There's two Chinese speakers here, and they're actually communicating with each other because they know Chinese. All you know is follow the rules based on this one image, symbol comes in, and then I do this other thing and stick it out. They're communicating. They're working at the level of meaning or syntax. Because you don't know the language, you're just following the level of semantics, rather. You're just working at the level of syntax or rules. This is what machines do. The machines that we design, they don't grasp meanings. And you all know this. You know that there's no agent. There's not a bank of people answering your questions when you do Google search, right? So there's a really good, I think, people that are strong AI advocates try to argue and have tried for decades to say somehow this argument doesn't work. It gets really obscure, but I think it's basically right. But here's a more kind of a transcendent a way of arguing that we are not reducible to computers. So the AI move and the transhumanist move, it works in two different directions. It both wants to elevate computers to the level of humans, agents, right? So that leads to the worry about Skynet waking up. But it then also tries to reduce humans to machines. And so will very often lead to a kind of denial that there's agency or free will. All right, so here's a kind of way, and this works for everyone because everyone actually is a person. That's the great thing about it. Even if you're an atheist, they're persons too. They didn't turn into machines. So I want you to think about ice cream. Maybe you don't want to do it. You just had Chick-fil-A, but I want you to close your eyes. All right, think about ice cream. I know I showed you a picture, so I know you're thinking of that picture probably, but just picture it. All right. All right, so what happens then? This is what happened and what you assumed. You assume all these things are true. First, that you're a person. That is, that you had first-person perspective. So you could think about ice cream, right? You have thoughts, all right? And now you're thinking, wow, this is really not that complicated, right? But these are crucial. You have reason. So I asked you to think about ice cream. You knew what that meant. You listened, and you came up with a picture of an ice cream cone or something, or whatever it was in your head, right? I asked you to think about eating ice cream. You freely did so based on my request. Right? You might have even had a hard time doing it. You might be distracted, right? But you did so, and everyone assumes this. So yeah, you told me to do it, and then I chose to do it. You didn't make me do it. And then those thoughts cause something to happen in your brain and elsewhere in your body. Okay, all of that stuff, that just doesn't make sense on materialism. Chemical reactions aren't about things in the way that your thoughts are about things. Right? If you are ultimately reducible to sort of deterministic laws of physics, or you could say, okay, maybe some quantum effects, but in that case, you're just dealing with sort of chance and randomness. But this is actually the picture everybody actually assumes to be true, whether they're materialists or not, is that you have thoughts and that they are about things. That is a property that thoughts have that physical objects don't have. Like leaves aren't about things in this way. The chemical or electrochemical reaction or neuronal, the connectome, right? The pattern of if you were doing a brain scan, it might correspond to your thoughts, but it's not about the ice cream in the same way, right? All this stuff, this is just stuff that absolutely everybody assumes to be true. Now you might say, but yeah, but maybe we're mistaken. Yeah, but if you're mistaken, you're a you being mistaken about it, right? Moreover, what possible reason could you have for thinking that's not true? Materialism. So what you're telling me is that you are more certain of the truth account of materialism than you are that you are a person that can have thoughts. But your thought about materialism is also a thought. See what's happening here? Materialism always hoists itself on its own petard if you sort of follow it far enough along. So everybody that's a materialist is constantly assuming and participating in activities and presupposing the falsity of materialism, even though they're not really quite aware of it, right? Now notice this isn't sort of biblical exegesis here, right? They're assuming something like this, that they're just reducible. Materialism assumes that they're reducible to nature and nurture and aren't agents. Nobody ever actually assumes this, believes this about himself. And then finally, so what do we do when you get to gender ideology? Well, here again, it's faith and reason. And so it's up to us to defend basic biology. Did anyone predict that? That it would be up to Orthodox Jews and the occasional Mormon and evangelical Christians and Catholics to defend biology against the hordes who are now denying it. But that is where we are. And we are there. We are in the moment, right, in which a guy like Colin Wright, whom I argued with about 10 years ago about Darwinism, I think on the internet, is now an ardent defender of biological reality. We are at the moment where I retweet Richard Dawkins, who still thinks they're boys and girls. That's the moment in which we live. And so how do you define sex precisely? All right, so what I didn't tell you about this slide is that it's a trick slide. Because all of you probably, if you haven't thought of this, you think the way to define sex is that females are XX and males are XY. I know you thought it. A lot of you thought it. That's a trick. That's the trick. That's the trap they have for us. That's not right. That is the way that sex in humans is normally determined at the chromosomal level. And that will correspond to your biological sex 99.98% of the time. But there are chromosomal variations. There's enough of them that if you have millions of people, there's going to be lots of variations. And the way sex is determined is not the same thing as what it is. In fact, there are some organisms in which chromosomes aren't what determine the sex of offspring. Sex of offspring are determined by the temperature of the water in which the mother is at the time. Right? So there are different mechanisms for determining sex, but sex is itself this fundamental kind of reproductive strategy of organisms. So what is it exactly? Well, you already know this because, first of all, was it likely it was chromosomes? I mean, if it was chromosomes, if that was how you define sex, did nobody know what sex was until we discovered chromosomes? I mean, that can't be quite right. We all knew it had something to do with reproduction, boys and girls and things like this, right? This is basically what sex is at the bottom. It is about the fusion of two different types of gametes, these sex cells, a large, relatively immobile gamete called ova, and the small mobile gametes called sperm. The female corresponds to the phenotype or the body structure or body plan that produces the large gamete, and the male, the small gamete. That's what sex is. So if you wanted to define a female, I'll just give it to you in all its glory here. You ready? A female is an individual who has, had, will have, or would have, but for a developmental or genetic anomaly or historical accident, the reproductive system that at some point produces, transports, and utilizes eggs for reproduction. That's a minimal definition of a female. That's stable across all sorts of organisms. It's rock solid. That is what gender ideology denies. They don't want to talk about that. They will not do it. If you don't believe me, just follow the people I follow on Twitter, and you can watch it absolutely every day. So in other words, we're going to focus now. That doesn't mean sex is just about the gametes. It's about the phenotypes. It's about these two body structures, all right? So notice that that's just really careful biology that's also fully consistent with the biblical anthropology, right? That God has made us male and female, and male and female, he created them, right? Created them. It says him and them in the same verse, right? And then he tells them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, right? So there's something about being human. As an individual, you're made in the image of God, but to fulfill the image and to fulfill that mandate, at least as a race, if not each of us as individuals, we come together in this complementary way to produce after our own kind. Why two? Why is it one man and one woman? Why is that makes sense? Why is it just Adam and Eve? There were examples of polygamy in the Old Testament. It was not endorsed. Well, because it takes exactly one fertile male and one fertile female to reproduce, to mate, right? So there's this kind of internal logic to it. And marriage then is the social institution that ratifies and protects this biological reality, because we know that children come from this union, and children are best raised in the homes of their married mother and father, right? That picture, right? Fully consistent with, fully consonant with the most basic biological reality, testified, and so strongly testified by nature that every culture at every time and place knows it, recognizes it in its laws and regulations and institutions, and it never occurred to any culture until very recently to try to deny this. We live at the moment in which it's being denied, and so it falls to us, right, to re-articulate in this moment, the beginning of the 21st century, the robust and complete explanatory power of the biblical anthropology. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jay. I think we have about 15 minutes for questions. So if you raise your hand, I will scamper over to you. Right? Yeah, we got a question here.
Hello, just wanted to say thank you for coming to start.
Yeah.
So according to a recent meta-analysis conducted by the American Society of Plastic Surgeons that looked at over 7,500 individuals who underwent gender-affirming care, they found that around 1% of individuals regretted their decision. And it's my understanding that that's associated with less psychological distress and better health outcomes for those individuals overall. So I was just wondering how you might respond to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is one study, but notice that it's involving adults. So this is where the claim that only 1% of the population desists or detransitions. So that's where the sort of basis of this claim is. So we're dealing with kind of two sets of populations. I didn't talk about this in the talk. So say, let's shift back 15 years from now. The prevalence of what's called gender dysphoria was extremely rare, almost entirely prepubescent males. And you look this up in the DSM-4. Moreover, the vast majority of them, if allowed to persist, desisted when they reached or went through puberty. So we knew this already, that there was gender dysphoria. It was extremely rare, and it was almost entirely associated with males. All right. Now, there were adults undergoing what we might call sort of gender surgery or something like that at the time. This wasn't happening with kids, and the vast majority resolved their feelings of discordance with their bodies. That's changed since about 2009. So we have a massive, massive increase in the number of kids presenting with these symptoms. So just one example of this, the Tavistock Clinic in the UK. So the UK had only one pediatric gender clinic, which closed a year ago. All right, remember that. So from 2009 to 2019, the number of kids being referred to the Tavistock Clinic increased by, take a guess, just don't yell it, but just think what percentage increase of kids being referred to the gender clinic with symptoms of gender dysphoria? Was it doubled, quadrupled? It increased 44 times. So it was an increase of 4,400% in the UK of kids being reported with gender dysphoria, and the majority were females. All right, so this is this idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria. So what we're dealing with now is unprecedented and a completely new thing. So if somebody asks me, so what percentage of kids that have that happen will later, and so they go through the gender affirming care protocol, will come to regret it? We have absolutely no idea because we haven't run the test on that yet. That's going to be a 20-year longitudinal survey. So the study that they're referring to is not an irrelevant sort of population. All right. Also, you look at the study yourself and notice where the cutoff was. All right. Notice where that. I'll just leave that for homework. All right. Here's the difficulty. So if you take a girl who is, I'm just going to use a girl as an example, teenage girl who starts to go through puberty and is uncomfortable with her body. So I'm not a girl, but I'm pretty sure that's somewhat common, right? To feel uncomfortable with your body, because 100% of guys, this is true. All right. And so let's say you don't like the fact that you're getting curvaceous, wish you were muscular or something, right? And then you put on testosterone. Most are going to feel a sense of euphoria. You're going to feel stronger. You're going to like what it's doing to your body. The kind of negative effects of that are going to be 2 or so years out. So the only way to know, like, what's the true rate of the percentage of this population that will detransition into desist, we're not going to know for 10, 20, or 30 years. What we do know is that virtually all kids that were allowed to go through puberty before this started happening reconciled with their bodies without becoming permanent medical patients taking cross-sex hormones. We knew that, and we know that there is orders of magnitude and greater numbers of kids presenting with these symptoms now. And so what that would mean is that if you're sort of being objective, you're going to say, okay, so we want to be really sure that the benefits of this radical medical intervention, which leads 100% of the time to sterilization in the end, are going to be just dramatically better. Every entity that has done a systematic review of the evidence has determined that the quality is low, very, very low. And these are countries that were doing it before us. So in this case, it would be the UK, Sweden, Finland, and now this summer, Denmark. Norway will probably happen in 2024. Countries that do systematic reviews of the evidence, not one study that the plastic surgeons who have, frankly, financial incentive, and let me predict it here, will likely get sued for these claims. They're not doing that. They have a financial incentive. Health authorities in very left-wing secular countries that do systematic reviews have all come out the same way. The quality of evidence that this helps kids is very, very low, and they stopped doing it, at least doing it like we're doing in the US. So the details are sort of complex, but if you're wanting to kind of follow the kind of assessment of the science, there's a great website called SEGM, SEGM, Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine.org, that sort of tracks this stuff. Great question. So I know it's kind of it's a complicated question, so I know I kind of got down in the weeds.
How do you think different cultural perspective influence our understanding and acceptance of diverse gender identities?
How do separate cultures? So there's a difference between, I talk just about the kind of like you'll call minimal biological definition of sex to say, okay, what is this thing if you're going to define it precisely, right? But there are things that we associate with sex that are conventional. So I put it this way. Sex is binary because of this. What binary means is that there's no transition gamete. So there can be disorders of sexual development. There's no spurg or erg or erm, right? There's sperm and there's egg. So that's why sex is binary. That's what that means. There are also sex characteristics that correspond to biological sex, but that are not binary. They're bimodal. So for instance, the average male is taller than the average female. Doesn't mean every male is taller than every female, because males and females, our height is distributed along a normal distribution, right? So sort of bell curves. And so if you did all the heights of men and all the heights of women, you'd get these two bell curves and they'd sort of partially overlap. All right, so it makes sense? So you've got the binary aspect of sex. You've got these bimodal distributions. There's a male typical and a female typical that are different, but then they can overlap, right? Then you have the kind of psychological effects of this. So for instance, there's some evidence that the average male, the way in which the average male, sort of analyzes movement in three-dimensional space is different from female. Things like that, right? And then there are things that are sort of cultural norms. So for instance, different kinds of jobs. There's been a lot of research about the types of people in countries in which you're free to choose any kinds of jobs. Are there male typical and female typical jobs? It turns out it varies a lot, not universally, but it varies a lot from culture to culture. Then there are kind of social conventions, right? So certain things that are just, think of them as gender stereotypes in which a culture associates something with a male or female, but it's not sort of intrinsically related. And then there are things that are entirely conventional. So for instance, in the United States, when babies are born, pink stands for girl and blue stands for boy, but there's nothing about the color pink or blue. So does that make sense? I think the way to think of this is that over on one side, there's this kind of fundamental binary nature of sex. Then there are the manifestations of biological sex that are sort of fall out according to a distribution. And then there are these kinds of manifestations that you could think of as the psychological and the social kind of manifestations of those things. And then there could be conventions. And then there can be sort of harmful stereotypes, right? And so this is where the problems actually very often arise. So we imagine, well, what's the typical way a male dresses or something, or a typical way a girl should dress? But some girls, I had a daughter like this, she didn't want to wear frilly dresses. Does that make her a boy? No, it just makes her maybe slightly atypical or something like that. And so that's why you don't want to slip from the binary nature of sex on one side to artificially rigid gender stereotypes on the other. Here's the irony. If you drop out sex as a biological category, do this for yourself. I'll leave this as homework. Look up some of the sort of gender identity questionnaires that kids are given. All right. To figure out what your gender identity is. And what you'll discover is it's a bunch of really rigid little stereotypes. Because what else are you going to have? Right? If biological sex is not a real thing, it's going to be, well, do you like dolls or trucks? Oh, you like dolls. Okay, 5 points for the girl, right? I mean, this sounds crazy, but this is where we are now. And so you can have a weird kind of reification of artificial gender stereotypes that can happen kind of on either side of the political spectrum. What you want is a kind of flexibility so that you're not mistaking artificial stereotypes for biological reality. And if you do it, right, you can either interpret a girl who's gender atypical as really a boy, or you could badger her and force her to wear things that she doesn't want to wear, neither of which is a good idea. So that's why the issue is somewhat complicated. I just focused on the nature of sex because that's contested. But remember that. On one side, you've got the binary nature of sex. On the other side, you've got purely conventional kind of gender stereotypes, and we don't want to be overly rigid about that. Somebody asked me a yes/no question.
I think you touched on this earlier, but just to clarify, is the current gender ideology unique to our point in history of human beings?
Well, and so far as I know, no one has ever no one has ever historically claimed like the concept of gender identity as an internal sense of gender. I would say even the concept, it can't be more than a few decades. It can't, I would say it didn't exist anywhere until it wasn't even in the 50s, but where exactly we say where the kind of idea came from, the idea that you could have an internal sense of gender that doesn't have any kind of reference to sex, and that could be contrary to one's sex. That is very much a new thing. Or the idea that sex is something that's assigned rather than observed, right? Those are new things. Those are based upon very particular contemporary sort of philosophical strains. Now, have there been cultures that, had sort of categories where you said, well, some people are neither boys or girls or something? Yeah, there's some things like that. But like these particular concepts require a kind of intellectual apparatus even to make sense, right? It's actually kind of hard to explain sane people. I mean, that's what made Matt Walsh's documentary so funny when he went to the Maasai, right? Is that it's like, okay, here's people that are like having to still live in reality, like in nature, and they're just laughing, right? That's what made that so funny. It was like, yeah, it requires a particular kind of moment in a particular culture even to be able to kind of construct these things.
From a biblical perspective, how do you understand the 1.7% of people born intersex? And from there, how do you approach the need for gender-affirming treatment for these individuals?
So the 1.7 number is actually false. It was proposed by a scholar and then refuted by another one. So the number is actually 0.018% of the population. The word intersex is kind of a misnomer. So notice I'm using either difference or disorder of sexual development. So the actual number is 0.018%. So it's a small number. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it's like a handful within 100,000. And so think of it this way, like think of an example. So humans are bipeds. That means it's part of human nature to have 2 legs as opposed to 4 legs like quadrupeds. So let's say you have a baby and the child is born without 2 legs. So what do we do in that case? Think about how we understand that, because we understand it. And because what you want to think is, how do we understand what biology and biological natures are? What something is in biology is what happens under normal development effectively. So no one says, oh, it must not be a human. You gave birth to a non-human, right? That doesn't occur to anyone. Or, oh, humans aren't bipeds. Nobody does that. They say, oh, well, the child was a genetic or chromosomal anomaly or a historical accident that caused development not to occur in the way that it otherwise would, right? And so in the same way, notice the way I defined female a minute ago, said, or would, but for a historical or genetic or chromosomal anomaly. And so what you do is you understand biological natures in terms of what normally happens, and then you accept that there are counterfactuals where those things are blocked. But it doesn't mean, okay, this person's not human. It just means that the normal course of biological development is blocked in some way. And so that's what you're dealing with disorders of sexual development. Every individual is either male or female and can, in most cases, that can be figured out quickly. The difficulty would be in a situation where, say, a culture's not medically advanced enough to be able to tell, in the case of ambiguous genitalia, whether a child is a male or female. And so those are just tough cases. Doesn't mean the child's not male or female. It's just that in, say, 99.98% of the time, a doctor can tell by simple observation if a child is male or female. In that rare case, it takes more analysis and investigation to figure out the sex of a child. So
I'm trying to shuffle back and forth across the room.
You're doing a good job.
Well, there are so many questions. Dr. Richards told me that afterwards, he's going to stick around if you want to ask him questions. But I'm going to let this be the last question. I know some of you have to go and read philosophy, declare philosophy as a second major because of the great lecture. But this
drop philosophy as your major, yeah.
But you get the privilege of asking the last question.
Sweet. All right. So my question is, you talked about the church becoming one of the last resorts for a reason and,
Yes.
and logic and such. In approaching these ideologies and stuff like that, would bringing in these terms and having more discussions like this inside of churches be a way to prepare believers for these situations?
Absolutely. I mean, I can tell you, pastors and priests are scared of this stuff, in part because it's just complicated and awkward, and also because there's these kind of complex issues. But if churches aren't doing it, who's going to do it exactly? And in some ways, I mean, the fact that Richard Dawkins has decided to destroy his public reputation defending biology and biological sex, I mean, and you know, the author of Harry Potter, right, is standing in the gap. Let that be convict us, because we're the ones that, in some ways, we're the only ones that sort of have the full picture. You know, Richard Dawkins, he's just counting on the kind of his knowledge of biology, and he's wrong about a bunch of stuff in biology too, right? But he's just relying on the kind of the dim light of reason that he has. We have the full story. We know not just that the world has been created, we know the personal name of God. And so if we can't and won't do it, I think we'll be held responsible for that.
Well, on that note, Dr. Jay Richards, thank you so very much.
Good to be with you all. Thanks.
Thank you for eating our Chick-fil-A as well. You're dismissed, and feel free to talk to Dr. Richards as well if you want to. Thank you for coming.